Stanley Kubrick's The Shining is not only my favorite horror film ever made, but one of my favorite films of all time. It's a movie that perfects the concept of ambiguous horror to a stunning degree. The reason this film is so terrifying is that instead of having a monster or killer like most other horror films, The Shining relies on the fear of the unknown, or more accurately, the fear of the uncertain or unclear. With expressive performances, a sinister soundtrack, and a setting that perfectly fits the tone of the film, The Shining is a timeless masterpiece. The Shining is a maze of different questions, answers, hints, clues, thoughts, and interpretations that is being masked by the seemingly simple story of a writer going insane inside a massive, isolated hotel. The Shining is a film I know Braden wants to talk about together, and I also want to make a solo video on it eventually, in addition to that video. We are not here to talk about The Shining today. Today I am going to discuss a different film. The Shining works so perfectly as a standalone story that wouldn't seek to benefit from a sequel. But lo and behold, in 2019, God answered the prayers he never made, and a sequel was released. This is Dr. Sleep. Hello everyone and welcome to the Movie Fanatics. My name is Brannick. Classic films often fall victim to getting sequels or reboots years after the original release. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade released in 1989, and Kingdom of the Crystal Skull released in 2008. Star Wars was dormant for 10 years before The Force Awakens. The Shining released in 1980, and in 2019, nearly 40 years later, Dr. Sleep was released to theaters. 2 years passed, and then I saw it. The movie follows Danny Torrance, who has fallen into alcoholism and has also stopped riding a tricycle. Danny was one of the most interesting characters in The Shining, second only to his father, so seeing the continuation of the story is an intriguing concept, and Ewan McGregor is always a plus. Danny has been left a mess by the childhood trauma that took place before, during, and after their stay at the Overlook Hotel. As stated before, he copes with his problems the same way Jack Torrance did before him, by turning to alcohol to dull the pain. The film progresses quite slowly at first, and our two main characters don't even meet until well into the film's runtime. The movie intersects with scenes between Danny and or Abra and the True Knot. The True Knot is a villainous cult of people who seek immortality by feasting on the pain of shiners like Danny and Abra. Dr. Sleep progresses like this until the True Knot becomes aware of Abra's power, and their stories begin to intersect. Danny works at a hospital, fitting for his childhood name, after recovering from alcoholism. He is trying to get his life back on track, but keeps getting messages on his chalkboard wall in his room from Abra. One of my favorite scenes in the film is when we are first introduced to the cat that can predict when patients are about to die. And what follows is a very touching scene where Danny helps a man cope with his own death before it happens. Dr. Sleep is the nickname bestowed upon Danny by the first dying man, though in the beginning I assumed the title referred to Snakebite Andy, a character I also assumed would have a much bigger role when she demonstrated her ability to push people to do whatever she asked, which at first was sleeping. Dr. Sleep is technically a horror film, but it doesn't really feel like it until they go to the Overlook, which, might I remind you, is in the last half hour of the film. For the rest of the runtime, it feels more like a supernatural drama or something of that sort. I'm not saying this movie needed more jump scares or something like that, and maybe I was just expecting the same type of horror that was present in The Shining, but that's not very realistic because The Shining's horror came from its ambiguity and its setting. The fear factor of The Shining all ties back to the Overlook. The Overlook is what gave The Shining its personality and its scariness. The atmosphere, environment, and anxiety created by the Overlook Hotel is why The Shining is scary, suspenseful, and brilliant. The Overlook appears to have something sinister hiding in every room, in every shadow, around every corner. This keeps the audience on their seats the entire time. Dr. Sleep does not have that same horror because it doesn't take place in the Overlook for the majority of its runtime. It went for something different. Different, but not very scary in my opinion. The Overlook was the heart and soul of the original film, but in Dr. Sleep, it's more so the backdrop of the climax. I'm not saying that the movie should have taken place in the Overlook Hotel the entire time, but I am saying that I don't really feel that same sense of unease that I do with The Shining for the majority of this film's runtime. The first real horror scene, in my opinion, was when the True Knot killed the baseball boy. The scene was very unsettling and disturbing. The boy's pleas for mercy were heartbreaking. This is when the True Knot first felt like a threat to me. Beforehand, they weren't really doing anything and they weren't even aware of our main characters, so I wasn't really threatened by them. And when they go down in a few gunshots later in the film during an action scene that feels incredibly out of place, it solidifies the fact that they were never really that scary to begin with. And as much as I loved Rose the Hat as a character, I never felt that she was very menacing either. And what should have been a very emotional scene where Abra learns that her dad has died comes off as pretty hollow and unemotional. I felt sadder when Billy died, though it also wasn't by much. I still enjoyed the True Knots shenanigans, even if I never really feared them outside of a few moments, and I enjoy that Dr. Sleep tries to distance itself from what came before and attempts to do its own thing, expanding on the story of The Shining while taking it in a new direction. The actress who played Abra is really good in the film and delivered a very convincing performance, and Ewan McGregor is excellent in almost everything he's in. I was somewhat worried going in that he'd keep his accent, but he masks it fairly convincingly. But now we come to the climax of the film, with Danny and Abra returning to the Overlook Hotel to set a trap for Rose the Hat, a concept that I think could have gone much worse. I was expecting more fan service than is actually in the movie. There's only a couple moments of it briefly when Danny is exploring the Overlook again and trying to wake it up. He finds the door with a hole in it, and there's an homage to the original where Danny rounds the corner, this time without the twins. The hotel is old and broken down, having been condemned after the events of the first film. One of my favorite scenes in the movie is where Danny sits at the Gold Room bar and has a conversation with Jack Torrance, who seems to think his name is Lloyd. Jack calls himself Lloyd, seemingly believing that it's his real name, just like Delbert Grady seemed not to remember being caretaker when Jack asked him about it in The Shining. They have a chat where Danny doesn't fall for the hotel's offer of a drink like his father did all those years ago, and Rose arrives afterwards. I love the part where Rose smirks at the avalanche of blood coming from the elevator. It's like the hotel is trying the same tricks that it pulled on the Torrances, but this time to no avail. Danny unleashes the ghosts of the hotel who kill Rose and then corrupt Danny. Danny then begins chasing Abra through the maze of hallways inside the Overlook. All the ghosts are recast, and most of them are pretty convincing, except for the guy who says, "Great party, isn't it?"
Great party, isn't it?
Danny is briefly redeemed and sacrifices himself while burning down the Overlook as Abra escapes to safety. The film ends with Abra shining to talk to Danny and confronting the hag in the bathroom just like Danny did in the beginning of the film. I'm glad Dr. Streep restrained itself in terms of fan service, but there were a few moments that I still think were a little much. I still fell for it though once the DS array started playing and Danny and Abra drove towards the hotel, and I got chills when the sinister last note played over the dormant Overlook. They use the Overlook well. I will give Dr. Sleep a 6 out of 10. In all honesty, I think the film could have benefited from being a completely separate story, a new IP instead of being tied to The Shining. The film could have breathed and separated itself from everything else. It tries its hardest to be different, and it's very commendable, but it can't fully divorce itself from the masterpiece that came before. Dr. Sleep had the daunting task of following up The Shining, which isn't the fault of the movie, but it's a problem nonetheless. This movie was never going to be better than The Shining. I knew that going in, and I feel like I kept my expectations in check. Still, this film is next to nothing like The Shining, aside from the obvious stuff, and that's a very good thing. If this movie had just taken place in the Overlook and not had its own, more original story, it would have just felt cheap and uninspired. Instead, Dr. Sleep is a good movie that has good ideas, incredible performances, and it was never meant to be better than The Shining. It's no secret that Stephen King has an intense disdain for Kubrick's original film, and he says that Dr. Sleep has redeemed that original movie. And if this movie brings closure to a 40-year-long disappointment, more power to this movie. Dr. Sleep is a good movie. It's not a masterpiece. I may hesitate to even call it a great movie, but it's good. I dislike certain aspects. I'm not the biggest fan of how it tries to remove the subtlety and ambiguity behind the Overlook. But even if I despise this movie, it wouldn't diminish my enjoyment of The Shining. I'll always have it to come back to, and I can see myself rewatching Dr. Sleep as well. And if I'm left with a film that's a worthy sequel to one of my favorite films ever made, then I'm satisfied. This is Brannick from the Movie Fanatics, signing off.
It's all forgotten now, the trouble and the pain.